Stand down, nurse. Dr. Landon Whitfield's finger was an inch from her face, and his voice carried all the way out into the hallway. Marlo Quinn didn't move, 32 years old, hair pulled back, hands hanging loose at her sides, because she'd learned a long time ago that steady hands say more than a raised voice ever will. Behind her, 14 people stood frozen. 2 residents, 3 nurses, a tech still holding a bag of saline he'd forgotten he was carrying, and along the white wall of that trauma room at St. Auberon Memorial, 4 men in black suits who hadn't said a word since they walked in and hadn't taken their eyes off anybody in that room. Marlo had about 40 seconds. She knew what the ultrasound screen behind that man's shoulder was showing, and she knew he was about to cut in the wrong place. She'd said it 3 times. 3 times he'd talked right over her, because in that room, under the nurse's badge she had taken up after her physician's license was unjustly frozen, she was just a night shift worker, picking up doubles to pay for Nell's care, and he was the man whose portrait hung in the lobby downstairs. "Do you hear me, Miss Quinn?" And then, in all that silence, the man on the gurney sat up, shirtless, wires taped across his chest, 34 years old, and even half-conscious he had a kind of stillness that made the men along the wall come off it all at once. He lifted 2 fingers to his temple, an old gesture, the kind you only understand if you've stood in front of death and walked back out. "Put your hand down," he said. His voice was gravel, but it carried. "That woman just saved my life." Whitfield's arm dropped like it had been cut, and Marlo Quinn stood in the middle of a room that had just changed hands, not yet knowing whose life she'd saved, or what it was going to cost her. If this one's already got you leaning in, hit that like button, share it with somebody who appreciates a story about the quiet ones, and subscribe so you don't miss a minute. It helps more than you know. Now let's go back to 11:44 that night, when the worst thing happening to Marlo Quinn was still just a phone call. The break room on the 2nd floor had only one light still burning, because the bulb above the coffee maker had gone out in the summer and no one had bothered to replace it. Marlo sat on the edge of a chair, her phone wedged between her shoulder and cheek, one hand still peeling the wrapper from an oat bar she wouldn't have time to eat. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who had read the same passage from the same document far too many times during her shift. The insurance company had denied coverage for this week's treatment. The diagnostic code didn't match. The paperwork would have to be submitted all over again. Marlo stopped unwrapping the oat bar. She asked 3 questions, and all 3 were brief and remarkably calm. The kind of calm a person learned only after making enough calls like this to understand that anger accomplished nothing except making the conversation last longer. How long would resubmission take? Would her sister still receive treatment while they waited? If Marlo paid cash right now, could they hold her appointment for this week? The woman on the other end answered the first question, hesitated over the second, and remained silent at the third long enough for Marlo to understand that the figure she had in mind was beyond her reach, still beyond her reach, just as it had been through the past several winters. She said thank you. She repeated Nell's full name one more time to make sure they had written it down correctly. Then she hung up. For the next 3 seconds, the break room on the 2nd floor was completely silent, and Marlo sat motionless with the half-unwrapped oat bar in her hand, staring at the dried coffee stain on the table without truly seeing it. Then she stood. She slipped the oat bar into her pocket, walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, and washed her hands a little longer than necessary, only a little longer. By the time she turned off the water, her face had returned to exactly what the face of a night shift nurse, preparing to step into the second half of her shift, was supposed to look like. That was what she did best. It wasn't needles. It wasn't intravenous lines. It was the ability to fold something away and put it out of sight until there was time to open it again. The radio in the hallway crackled just as she stepped through the door. The dispatcher's voice came through the static, quick and clear. The kind of voice people used when they had just received information from the scene and knew that every passing second carried a price. Male, in his 30s, accident on Route 47, near the turnoff for the old industrial district. Vehicle forced into the roadside drainage ditch. Foreign object penetrating the abdominal area. Blood pressure falling. Identity not yet confirmed. Marlo didn't run. She moved quickly, and as she walked, she had already begun calculating, because that was a habit no one could take from her, not even the people who had taken everything else. Route 47 was almost empty at this hour. The drainage ditch along that stretch of road was deep, and a car forced down into it wasn't the result of one wrong turn of the wheel. She pushed open the door to emergency room number 1 and Camila Ortiz was already there, pulling the equipment cart into position with the expression of a newly graduated nurse who still believed that if she prepared carefully enough, everything would be all right. The gurney came through before the door was fully open. The paramedic delivered the handoff while running, reading out a blood pressure that sounded more like a question than an answer. Someone shouted that the intravenous line had come loose in the ambulance, and the entire room immediately turned toward the abdomen of the man lying there, where the gauze had already soaked dark, and anyone could see at once that this was where their attention was needed. Marlo didn't look there. She stepped to the head of the gurney, pressed 2 fingers against the man's wrist, and held them there for 3 beats before looking at anything else. His pulse was rapid, thready, and far weaker than the amount of blood on that gauze could explain. His skin was cold and damp, and when she lifted her head to call out the reading, she caught her first glimpse of his face. The face of a man whose name no one in this hospital knew, and no one in that room understood that the night had only just begun. Everyone in the room was doing exactly what an emergency room had been trained to do. One nurse was cutting away the rest of the man's clothing. Another was opening a bag of intravenous fluid. The resident on the night shift was reading the blood pressure aloud for the second time, and his voice was slightly higher than it had been the first. Every pair of hands in the room was focused on the abdomen, on the darkened gauze, on the wound that was so large, so obvious, and so easy to understand that no one thought to ask another question. Marlo remained at the head of the gurney. She turned the man's head to one side, and what she saw made her straighten. The veins in his neck were swollen, standing out sharply beneath his skin, swollen in the way they became when blood couldn't find its way back. She placed her stethoscope against his chest, moving it gradually toward the left, and the sound of his heart came back distant and muffled, as though someone had laid something over it. She looked up at the monitor. His blood pressure had fallen again, and it was dropping faster than the amount of blood on the gauze could explain. Inside her mind, 3 separate pieces slid into their proper places at the same moment, smoothly and cleanly, in the way only knowledge repeated often enough could fall into place. It wasn't the abdomen, it was the heart. Blood was collecting around it, and with every passing minute, that sac tightened a little more, until the heart trapped inside no longer had enough room to fill. She turned, pulled the ultrasound machine from the corner of the room, and one of its wheels let out a sharp squeal against the tile. Someone asked what she was doing. She didn't answer. She applied the gel, placed the probe just below the tip of the breastbone, and angled it toward the man's left shoulder at an angle her hand remembered better than her mind did. The image appeared on the screen almost immediately. A dark layer of fluid surrounded the heart, thick and even, and within it, the right chamber was being compressed every time it tried to expand. Camila stood behind her, staring at the screen, and Marlo clearly heard the young woman draw in a breath. Marlo pressed the save button. She glanced at the corner of the screen. 11:51 at night. She saved a second image from a different angle so no one could claim the first had been a chance view. Then she pulled her work phone from her pocket, opened the medical records system, and typed an internal message directly to the head of surgery on duty that night. It was brief and contained not one unnecessary word. She stated clearly that there was fluid around the heart. She included the blood pressure. She stated clearly that the blood loss from the abdomen didn't explain the man's present condition, and she included the time. She pressed send. A check mark appeared on the screen, and it was at that precise moment, when she lifted her eyes from the phone and looked back at the man's chest, that she saw it. An old scar ran along his breastbone, faded by the passing years, so faint that it could easily be overlooked beneath the lights of the emergency room. Marlo faltered for half a beat, only half a beat. Then she looked away, because a man was dying on the table and she didn't have time for anything else. She called Camila closer and told her to prepare the drainage kit and keep it within reach. "Don't open it," she said. "Just have it ready." Camila looked at her for 1 second, then obeyed without asking a question. The resident turned back, saw that the ultrasound screen was still illuminated, and asked whether she was certain. Marlo said she was. He looked at the image, then at the gauze covering the abdomen, then back at the image, and his face took on the expression of a young man who had just realized that the 2 things before him couldn't both be true, and that choosing which one to believe wasn't his decision to make. "The head of surgery was on his way down," he said. Marlo looked at the monitor. The blood pressure had fallen another 4 points since she sent the message. She looked at the face of the man on the gurney, at the jaw that had begun to lose its color, at the lips turning a shade she had learned never to look at for too long, and she thought, very clearly and very calmly, that she had about 10 minutes left, perhaps less. Then the door opened. Dr. Landon Whitfield entered the room with the manner of a man who had never needed to hurry anywhere in his life. And the strange thing was that the entire room immediately slowed down around him. He greeted the resident by his first name. He nodded to the nurse hanging the bag of fluid and asked whether her son had recovered from his cough. Then he looked toward Marlowe and spoke her name, fully and clearly, his voice warm, as though he had just encountered an old colleague in the hallway. That was what made it difficult to hate him. He remembered the name of everyone in this building, and he sincerely believed that remembering a person's name was a form of kindness. Marlowe began before he had even finished putting on his gloves. She told him there was fluid around the heart, that she had saved the images, and that the blood pressure was falling faster than the abdominal wound could explain. Whitfield listened to everything without interrupting a single word. Then he lightly patted the edge of the gurney and said that he deeply appreciated her attentiveness, that observant nurses were the most valuable thing on any night shift, but in a patient whose blood pressure was falling after a penetrating injury, the heart was almost always under some mild compression, and what people saw on a bedside ultrasound was often nothing more than a small amount of reactive fluid. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He told her she was right, only right in a way that didn't matter. Marlowe turned the ultrasound screen toward him and asked him to look at just one thing, the right chamber of the heart each time it tried to expand. Whitfield looked. He looked for approximately 2 seconds, and Marlowe knew exactly how long those 2 seconds lasted, because she had counted them. Then he said the image was unclear, that the probe had been held at a slight angle, and that in a regional hospital with a machine long past its prime, people could see fluid anywhere if fluid was what they were looking for. That was the second time. This time, he didn't deny what she had seen. He denied the machine, denied her hand, and denied the entire building. The resident lowered his eyes to the medical chart. Camila stood motionless beside the equipment cart, still holding the unopened drainage kit. Marlowe continued, and she could clearly hear that her voice remained even, that it hadn't risen at all. She told him that if he opened the man's abdomen and the source of the bleeding wasn't there, they would lose him on the table, and that draining the fluid would take only 3 minutes. If she was wrong, they would have lost nothing but those 3 minutes. Whitfield removed his left glove and put it on again, a small, precise gesture. And as he did, he said it for the 3rd time. He asked her how many trauma surgeries she had ever stood in on. The question was delivered in a very soft voice, almost a gentle one, and it wasn't a question at all. It was a way of reminding everyone in the room who each of them was. Marlowe didn't answer. She looked at the monitor, saw the number fall once more, and opened her mouth to speak one final time. Later, when it was all over, when Whitfield's arm had fallen to his side, and 4 men in black suits had moved away from the white wall, when the man on the gurney had been laid back down with his eyes closed and his breathing shallow, Marlowe stepped back twice toward the wall behind her. She stepped back because she had finished calculating. If she remained there and turned this into an argument, that argument would take up the space of everything else in the room. People would watch her and Whitfield instead of watching the monitor. They would remember who had raised their voice louder instead of remembering who had been right. And during that time, the only person who would lose wouldn't be her or Whitfield. It would be the man lying on the table, the one person who had no voice in any of this. She had lost an argument like that once before. She remembered with perfect clarity what it had taken from her. So she stepped back until her shoulders touched the wall, her arms resting at her sides, and she didn't take her eyes from the monitor for even a second. Camila looked at her without understanding. Marlowe didn't explain. She only spoke very softly, just loudly enough for the young woman to hear, and told her to keep that kit in her hands and not put it down. Whitfield began, and for the first minute, everything unfolded exactly as it should have in an emergency room. There was the sound of instruments touching a steel tray, the sound of people calling out readings, and the steady breathing of a team working under the direction of someone they were accustomed to following. Marlowe stood against the wall and listened. She could hear more than she could see because, from where she stood, the backs of 3 people blocked almost her entire view, but no one could block the sound. She heard the suction, and that sound was the first thing that made her frown, because it sounded shallow and sparse. Nothing like the sound one should hear when opening a cavity that was supposed to be full. Whitfield called for more gauze. Then he asked for more light. Then he told someone to pull the retractor a little farther to the left. That was when Marlowe realized the rhythm of his hands had changed. Before, Every movement had flowed into the next without any space between them, the rhythm of a man who knew where he was going. Now, there were tiny pauses between his movements. Half a second, a quarter of a second, pauses only someone who had once stood in that position would recognize. He was searching, and a man who had found what he was looking for didn't keep searching. Marlowe looked at the monitor. The number fell again. Then it fell once more. The resident read the measurement aloud, and this time his voice didn't rise. It went flat, the voice of a man who had run out of options. Camila turned her head, searching for Marlowe over another person's shoulder, and there was a question in the young woman's eyes that she hadn't yet dared to ask. Marlowe gave the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. She counted silently, not because she was waiting, but because she needed to know exactly how much time she had left. Then the sound in the room changed. It didn't become louder. It simply changed. The steady beeping that everyone in this building heard so often that they no longer noticed it suddenly stretched out, the notes joining together until they became an entirely different sound. Someone spoke 3 words, and those 3 words fell into the room, like something heavy striking the tile floor. For the next half-second, the entire room stood still. Marlowe had witnessed that half-second many times in her life. The moment when everyone understood the same thing at precisely the same time, and the person in charge had no moves left. Whitfield's hands stopped. She stepped away from the wall. She stepped around the head of the gurney, wedging herself directly into the central command position. Cutting through the chaos, her command was cold and absolute. Move aside. Whitfield didn't move immediately. He looked at her, and in that moment, something passed behind his eyes. It wasn't agreement, and it wasn't quite fear. It was the uncontrolled reaction of a man accustomed to being the one who made every decision in every room, who had just encountered something that didn't consider that habit important. "He's dying," Marlowe said. "Move aside." He stepped to one side. Camila placed the kit in Marlowe's hand before Marlowe could even turn her palm upward. Marlowe didn't thank her or look at her. She merely said, "I need more light here," and someone turned the lamp. With 3 quick, decisive strokes, she disinfected the area below the tip of the breastbone, held the ultrasound probe in her left hand to see the path ahead, then guided the needle in with her right hand at an upward angle toward the man's left shoulder, moving slowly and steadily, never taking her eyes from the screen. The room was so quiet that Marlowe could clearly hear her own breathing. Then she felt the faint release beneath her fingertips, the tiny give that her hand recognized before her eyes could confirm it. And on the screen, the needle tip was exactly where it needed to be. She connected the tubing. She drew back, and for the next 4 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the monitor made a different sound. The number rose, only slightly, so little that anyone who hadn't been waiting for it wouldn't have noticed. Then it rose again. Someone behind her released a sharp breath. The resident read out the new measurement, and this time his voice had weight again. Marlowe didn't take her eyes from the monitor. She continued drawing the fluid out, slowly and steadily, and told the entire room, her voice still as level as it had been while she stood against the wall, to call the operating room immediately, that this had only bought them time and hadn't fixed anything, and that this man's chest needed to be opened within the next half hour. No one questioned her again. The surgery lasted until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, and when Marlowe went up to the 3rd floor to retrieve her coat from her locker, she realized the building was no longer the same building she had left at midnight. The 3rd floor corridor was usually the noisiest place in the hospital at this hour, filled with the rattle of carts, the sound of the broken coffee maker, and the voices of 2 night shift nurses talking too loudly because they thought no one could hear them. Tonight, there was nothing. 4 men in black suits stood along the corridor, each spaced exactly the same distance apart, none of them leaning against the wall, looking at a phone, or speaking a word to one another. The east elevator had been taken out of service, and a maintenance sign had been taped across it by the hand of someone unaccustomed to putting up signs. In the waiting area at the far end of the corridor, an old man sat alone, both hands resting on the top of his cane, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the recovery room door. He wasn't reading anything. He wasn't holding a phone. He didn't ask anyone a single question. He simply sat there, and the way he sat told Marlowe that he could remain in that position until morning if necessary. She walked through the middle of it all, with her coat draped over one arm. No one stopped her. No one looked at her for long, but she felt every gaze pass briefly over her before moving away. the kind of scrutiny used by men trained to remember faces, not to frighten people. Marlowe had lived long enough in rooms filled with this kind of silence to know that it didn't come from fear. It came from order. Somewhere in this building was a man around whom no one else would make noise while he slept. Everett Doyle was waiting for her in the nurse's break room with a file on the table and 2 cups of coffee that both of them knew no one would drink. He was the hospital administrator, a thinning-haired man who wore glasses, and one of the few people in the building whom Marlowe believed was genuinely kind. Not merely kind in the way of someone who remembered other people's names. He sat down first, then invited her to sit, and it took him several seconds to begin speaking. Dr. Whitfield had filed an incident report, he said. It cited acting beyond the scope of her professional authority, performing an invasive procedure without authorization, and forcing the attending physician away from his position during an ongoing case. Doyle read every word as though each one weighed more than it had any right to. Then he told her the rest. Suspension from duty, effective immediately, pending review by the board. Marlowe didn't argue. She didn't ask who had signed it, didn't ask when the hearing would take place, and didn't say a single word about what had allowed the man upstairs to keep breathing. She looked at the file on the table for a moment, then raised one hand to her chest, removed her employee badge, and placed it on the counter between the 2 cups of cold coffee. Doyle looked at the badge as though he wished he hadn't seen it. He said he was sorry, and he said it in the way of a man who knew perfectly well that his apology wouldn't change anything, yet still had to offer it because otherwise he wouldn't be able to sleep. Marlowe stood, put on her coat, then paused in the doorway. Without looking back, she said exactly one thing to him. "Don't read the medical record," she said. "Pull the monitor data from emergency room number 1 tonight and read that, starting at 11:45. Read the blood pressure, the rhythm, and every single alarm. The medical record is what people write after everything is over. The machine records what happens while it's happening, and it doesn't know who anyone is." Then she left. The employee parking garage was so empty that she could hear the wind moving between the rows of pillars. Marlowe opened her car door, climbed inside, pulled the door shut, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. She didn't start the engine. She sat there for a long while, long enough for the windshield to begin fogging from her own breath. And as she sat, she thought about 3 things in precisely that order. She thought about Nell and her dialysis treatment that week. She thought about the employee badge left behind on the counter in the 2nd-floor break room, and about the fact that she would have no paycheck between now and the board hearing. Then she thought about the old scar running down the man's breastbone, and this time, she didn't push it aside. Camila called on the morning of the 3rd day, her voice low and quick, the voice of someone standing where other people were passing by. "He's awake," she said. He had been awake since the night before. The day team had gone in 3 times, and all 3 times he had refused to let them examine him. He hadn't been angry or raised his voice. He had simply said he would wait. "Wait for whom?" Marlowe asked. Camila fell silent for a beat, then said he didn't know Marlowe's name, but he had described her. He had described her very accurately, even the way she spoke. "He's asked 3 times already," Camila said, "and every time he's asked the same question. He wants to know where the woman who put the needle into his chest is." Marlowe stood in the kitchen of her apartment, still holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago, and stared out the window for exactly 3 seconds before answering. She was suspended. She had no badge. She had no reason to enter that building, and at least 2 very clear reasons not to. She set the cup down and told Camila she would be there in half an hour. The back entrance near the parking garage was still unlocked, just as it had been for the past several seasons. She took the stairs, came out on the 2nd floor, went around the pharmacy, and reached the 3rd floor by the route the cleaning staff used. There were still 2 men in black suits in the corridor, 2 fewer than there had been that night, and they looked at her exactly once before turning away, the look of men who had been shown a photograph and had committed the face to memory. Room 214 was at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar. She pushed it open. He seemed much larger than she remembered, and she understood at once that it wasn't because he had changed, but because this was the first time she had seen him while he was conscious. People occupied space differently when they were aware of themselves. The head of the bed was raised about 40 degrees, as high as the drainage tubes would allow, and his skin carried the color of a man who had surrendered a great deal of blood and received only some of it back. But his eyes were open, and they found her the instant the door moved. They looked at each other for a while without either of them speaking. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of silence shared by two people who both understood that careless words carried a price in certain circumstances. "You're the one," he said. His voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. "I'm the one who put the needle in," she said. "Another team opened your chest and repaired the tear." He absorbed that information without changing his expression, and his eyes moved over her once, quickly and systematically. It wasn't the way a man looked at a woman. It was the way someone took inventory of an unfamiliar room. "You aren't wearing a uniform," he said. "No, they suspended you." It wasn't a question. Marlowe stepped fully into the room and allowed the door to close behind her. She didn't answer. She pulled the visitor's chair a little closer, only close enough to keep their conversation from carrying through the door, then stood beside it, instead of sitting down. "You should sleep," she said. "I'll sleep later." He shifted slightly, and the monitor recorded the movement with a small rise before settling back to where it had been. His jaw tightened once at the price of that movement, then relaxed again with the deliberate control of someone who had practiced enduring pain without advertising it. Marlowe looked down at his chest, where the fresh bandages covered nearly everything, but not quite. She spoke her next words in precisely the same voice she used when reading out measurements. "The scar on your breastbone. The old one, not the one from this week. I've seen that line of stitches only twice in my life. Neither time was in a hospital." The room fell silent. He stared at the ceiling for a while, and Marlowe let him, because she had learned that people often revealed the most important things in the silences no one tried to fill. Then he spoke a name. "Ansel Prieto." Marlowe sat down. She hadn't intended to sit. Her legs did it before she could make the decision, and she knew he had noticed, and she knew he would remember. "He's dead," the man said. "I know," she replied. He studied her longer than he had before. "Who were you to him?" Marlowe didn't answer immediately. She looked at her hands resting in her lap, then raised her eyes. "Who were you to him?" she asked in return. He almost smiled. It wasn't truly a smile, only something that touched the corner of his mouth and stopped there without completing the journey. Then he told her his name, Rocco Santangelo, and gave her the rest without evading a single word. He said his family did things she would read about in the newspapers if she cared to look. He said the men standing outside the room belonged to him, and he said she should know that before she told him anything more. Marlowe listened to all of it. She didn't rise. She didn't look toward the door. In that same steady voice, she simply told him that in that case, he should lie still and finish everything they brought him to eat, because a mafia boss's blood pressure fell exactly the same way as everyone else's. He didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the ceiling, and when he continued, he still didn't turn toward her. Marlowe understood that it wasn't rudeness, but the only condition under which he could bring himself to speak. He told her there was a reason his men weren't permitted to harm medical professionals, and that reason had nothing to do with morality. It came from an afternoon in South Philadelphia when he was very young. His mother had taken him to the hospital for something ordinary, and while they were there, she had suddenly fallen ill in the middle of the corridor. He reached that point and stopped. And what he told her next wasn't what had happened to his mother, but what had happened in that corridor. Someone knew whose wife she was. The name was spoken very softly between two people in white coats, standing a few steps away, and that name accomplished something no rule in that building ever could. It made everyone slow down. No one refused to do anything. No one said anything cruel. It was simply that the footsteps that should have moved quickly didn't. The eyes that should have turned toward her looked elsewhere instead, and between all those things lay a silence so long that even now he couldn't remember how long it had lasted. An acquaintance of the family had managed to lead him away first, out to the corridor near the main entrance, where there was light and the sound of traffic from the street. He had sat there holding a cup of water no one told him to drink. He said he couldn't remember a single image from that afternoon. Not one. The only thing he had carried with him from that day until now was the sound, or more precisely, the absence of sound. The silence of people in white coats inside a building where there should always have been the sound of running footsteps. Still looking at the ceiling, he continued. He said he had never demanded that anyone think well of his family, and he had never believed he had the right to demand such a thing. He wanted only one thing. The person wearing the white coat had to step forward, no matter what family name belonged to the person lying on the floor. Then he fell silent. Marlowe said nothing for a long while. She didn't tell him she was sorry, because she had heard enough expressions of sorrow in her life to know how little they weighed. She simply sat there, and when she finally spoke, she talked about the drainage tubes, how long he needed to lie on each side, and how he had to eat even when he didn't want to. He listened to everything, nodded once, and didn't mention another word about what he had just told her. Camila was waiting for her in the second-floor stairwell, leaning against the railing with her arms folded across her chest and the expression of someone who had been holding something inside for too long. She began speaking the moment Marlo reached her. That night, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, while Marlo was still in the operating room, Camila had gone into the corridor behind the administrative wing to collect some printer paper. No one was usually there at that hour. Dr. Whitfield was standing with his back turned, his phone pressed to his ear. Camila said she hadn't heard the entire conversation, only one sentence, and she had remained frozen where she stood for several seconds before stepping back. He had told the person on the other end that the ultrasound image needed to be cleaned up. Marlo didn't ask her to repeat it. She looked at Camila and waited. The young woman opened her shoulder bag, removed a stack of papers folded in half, and handed it to her. "I printed it immediately afterward," Camila said. "All the monitor data from emergency room number 1, from before the gurney arrived until they transferred him to the operating room. I also photographed both ultrasound images with my personal phone. The time is visible on each one. I sent them to my private email account, not through the hospital system." Her voice trembled slightly on the final sentence, not because she was afraid, but because this was the first time in her life she had done something knowing that if she was wrong, no one would be there to protect her. Marlo took the papers, folded them once more, and slipped them inside her coat. Then, she told Camila not to mention any of this to anyone in the building. From that moment forward, not even the person she trusted most. On the morning of the 5th day, Rocco Santangelo signed the document stating that he was leaving the hospital against medical advice, and he signed it with the neat signature of a man who had signed many things in his life without reading them twice. The doctor on duty told him 3 times that it was a bad decision. Rocco thanked him 3 times. The private nurse Gideon Amato had hired the day before pushed his wheelchair out to the car, and Rocco didn't object to the wheelchair, something Gideon noticed and chose not to mention. By noon, Rocco was seated at the head of the dining table in his own home, a table long enough for 12 people, though only 3 were seated there that day. Rocco sat at one end, Gideon sat to his right, both hands resting on the top of his cane as they always did. The third person was Bruno Falchi, a younger cousin on his mother's side, seated several chairs away, and for the first 20 minutes, Bruno spoke more than anyone else in the room. The nurse stood about 3 steps behind the wheelchair, holding a bag of medication. Her eyes lowered toward the floor as she pretended not to hear anything. Rocco let Bruno talk. He had always allowed people to talk, because those who spoke too much invariably revealed more than they intended. Bruno talked about the local reporters who had already begun asking questions, about the hospital keeping Rocco's records under a name anyone could search, and then he finally reached the part he had wanted to discuss from the beginning. He said that doctor was a problem. He said the man had written things in the medical record that would cause trouble later. Then, in the voice of someone who believed he was making himself useful, Bruno said that all it would take was one evening for the doctor to understand how he ought to rewrite everything more neatly. Rocco didn't shout. He didn't strike the table, change his position, or even frown. He merely turned his head and looked at Bruno. He looked at him for a long time, long enough for Bruno to laugh once and then stop laughing, long enough for Gideon to remove his hands from the top of his cane and place them in his lap, long enough for the ticking of the clock on the cabinet across the room to become suddenly clear. Then Rocco spoke, his voice hoarse and very soft, because his chest wouldn't allow anything louder. "You just spoke about a doctor in this house. Get out. Stand in the hallway until I call you." No one said a word. Bruno looked around the table, searching for a face that would take his side, and found none. Gideon lowered his eyes to the tabletop. The nurse behind the wheelchair stood as still as a pillar. Bruno pushed back his chair, rose, and walked into the hallway, and the sound of the door closing behind him was the only noise in the room for the next several seconds. Rocco turned back toward Gideon. "Go on," he said. Gideon opened his leather briefcase, removed 3 sheets of paper, and placed them on the table in order. He didn't speak in circles, because he was old, and because he had known Rocco since the boy was too small to reach the top of this table. The truck that had forced Rocco into the ditch that night had been reported stolen several days earlier, and the report had been filed in Camden. It had been found abandoned not far from the scene, with nothing and no one inside. Rocco studied the 3 sheets for a moment. Then he asked Gideon a question that had nothing to do with the truck. He asked how many people had known that he would be taking Route 47 that night. Gideon remained silent. He knew the answer, and he knew Rocco knew it too. And he understood that the question hadn't been asked to obtain information, but to force that information to be spoken aloud in this room. "You changed the route at the last minute," Gideon said. "You changed it because of the rain. It wasn't on any schedule. No one wrote it down. No one sent it to anyone." He stopped. Then he spoke the rest more slowly. "Only a few people knew, and every one of them eats at this table." Rocco placed his hand flat against the tabletop, his palm facing down, and kept it there for a while. His chest hurt whenever he drew a deep breath, so he didn't draw one. He looked along the length of the table at the 9 empty chairs, and thought of every name that had ever occupied them. He thought about how his father had once told him that the thing that killed a family never came from outside it. "Someone in this house sold me," he said. No one answered. In the hallway, Bruno Falchi was still waiting. The old man with the cane waited for her at the small diner across from the laundromat, the place where Marlo still ate breakfast on mornings when she finished late, and the fact that he knew she would come there was the first thing that made her understand they had investigated her. He didn't rise when she arrived. He merely used the tip of his cane to push out the chair across from him and introduced himself as Gideon Amato. Then he added that he had come alone and that the young man didn't know he was there. Marlo sat down. She asked why he hadn't waited until Rocco was stronger. Gideon studied her for a moment, then said that once the boy was stronger, he would do everything his own way, and his way was always slower than necessary, because he had to make certain he was right before he acted. Gideon said he was old and didn't have time to be certain. He placed a slim leather briefcase on the table and pushed it toward her. Marlo didn't open it immediately. She asked what was inside. Gideon said it contained everything his men had uncovered about Dr. Landon Whitfield during the past 4 days. He added that they hadn't broken into anywhere. Every document was publicly available. No one had ever been willing to spend the money required to piece them all together. She opened the briefcase. Inside were copies arranged in chronological order, medical licenses from 3 states, lists of the facilities where he had held surgical privileges, tax records for a small medical consulting company registered in his name, and a collection of independent assessments he had signed while serving as an expert reviewer for disciplinary boards in several different places. Marlo moved through them quickly, with the habit of someone accustomed to reading medical records, searching for dates first and only then reading the contents. Then she stopped. She stopped at a document near the end of the stack, a faded copy she recognized not because of the name printed on it, but because of the shape of the signature. She had seen that signature enough times to recognize it in the dark. It appeared at the bottom of an independent assessment, concluding that her clinical decision in a Baltimore case had failed to meet the accepted standard of practice. She had never met the person who signed it. They hadn't allowed her to. She had only been given a copy, signed with an initial and the surname Hollis, a name she had pursued relentlessly for nearly 3 years. Marlo raised her eyes to Gideon. She had suspected Landon Whitfield for months. She had noticed how he meticulously dropped his mother's maiden name, Hollis, from all public facility rosters, using only Landon Whitfield to blur his past. But suspicion wasn't proof. The old man simply reached across and turned to another page for her, an old medical registration form, explicitly listing his full legal name, Landon Whitfield Hollis. The final, undeniable piece of evidence had just been placed in her hands. She sat perfectly still. Outside the window, a bus stopped and pulled away again, and the sound of its brakes seemed to come from a place very far away. Marlo thought about the past 3 winters. She thought about all the evenings she had spent sitting at her computer, cross-referencing reviewer files, and how following a small lead about New Jersey had brought her to St. Auberon. She hadn't been blindly walking these corridors. She had been circling her target, waiting for the one paper that would strip away his shield. She had made coffee for him in the break room, called him doctor, and kept her voice level, all while waiting for this exact moment. Gideon allowed the silence to endure for exactly as long as it needed to, before he continued. He said there was something else she should know before she discovered it herself. His men had compared the list of cases in which Whitfield had served as the primary surgeon at all 3 facilities, and they had found several records where the post-operative notes didn't match the monitor data stored in the system. There were more than a dozen such records. Gideon said the number might not be accurate, and there could be more, because they had only examined what they had been able to obtain so far. Marlo closed the stack of documents. She asked why he was giving all of this to her, instead of taking it directly to the police. Gideon smiled, a brief and joyless smile. He said that if he took it to the police, the first thing they would ask was who he was, and the answer would destroy everything in that briefcase before anyone had a chance to read the second page. Then, more slowly, he added that there was another reason. She was the only person in this entire matter whom no one could buy with anything they already possessed. That afternoon, Marlo arrived at the dialysis center before the scheduled time to pick up her sister, and she arrived just as they were removing Nell's needles. The 21-year-old was thinner than she had been the previous spring. She sat in a reclining chair in the last row, with a book folded face down across her lap and her sleeve rolled up to the elbow. As the nurse bandaged the needle site, she spoke to Nell in the quiet, hesitant voice of someone forced to deliver news she didn't want to give. "I've just received a notice. The insurance company still hasn't approved the treatment again this week, so we can't schedule your next session yet." Nell listened. She didn't cry. She didn't ask the nurse to repeat herself, demand to speak to anyone, or say a word about what this would mean for her body over the next 7 days. She merely looked down at the bandage on her elbow, then raised her eyes and asked one question. "Could I have an appointment for next week, then? I don't want my sister to have to call again." Marlo stood in the doorway and heard every word. She didn't enter immediately. She remained there for several seconds, still holding her car keys, and allowed something inside her chest to pass before stepping into the room and cheerfully telling Nell that she had parked in the shade so the car wasn't hot today. Nell talked throughout the drive home, about the book she was reading, about a neighbor's cat that kept lying across the doorway, and about how she wanted to return to evening classes in the fall. Marlo drove and responded at the proper moments, while inside her mind, 3 events were arranging themselves into a shape she didn't like. The suspended dialysis treatment wasn't the only thing that had happened that week. The previous morning, the State Board of Nursing had sent her a letter informing her that it had received an anonymous complaint, accusing her of practicing beyond the scope of her authority, and that her case was undergoing preliminary review. That afternoon, when she called her former hospital in Baltimore to request a copy of her original disciplinary record, something she had a legal right to receive, a person in the records department told her that the file had been placed under restricted access and couldn't be released at that time. 3 things in 4 days, all after she had placed her employee badge on the counter. Marlo didn't believe in coincidences, but she was also clear-headed enough to know that refusing to believe in coincidences was the quickest path to paranoia. So she wrote all 3 events on a sheet of paper, recorded the dates and times, and stored it with the monitor data Camila had given her. She told Rocco the next morning in room 214, while checking the bandages. She knew he had changed himself, even though he wasn't permitted to do so. She told him briefly, listing exactly 3 events without adding any emotion. He listened to everything. He didn't ask her a single question. He didn't ask for the name of the person in the records department, where the dialysis center was located, or what she wanted him to do. He simply reached for the phone on the bedside table, dialed a number, and spoke for approximately 40 seconds, in the same calm, hoarse voice he used to ask what he would be served that day. Then he ended the call and placed the phone face down on the blanket. That afternoon, the dialysis center called Nell. They said the matter had been verified. Her original appointment would remain unchanged, and she should arrive at her usual time. 40 minutes later, the records department in Baltimore sent Marlo an email explaining that there had been a classification error and that a copy of her file would be sent that day. Before nightfall, the State Board of Nursing sent another letter informing her that the anonymous complaint had been withdrawn and the preliminary review had been closed. Marlo read all 3 messages, one after another, while sitting at the kitchen table in her apartment, and she felt no relief. She returned to the hospital that evening. Rocco was sitting more upright than he had been the day before, and he had finished his entire dinner. He watched her enter with the expression of a man who knew precisely why she had come. Marlo didn't sit down. "What did you do to them?" she asked. "I spoke to them," he said. "People don't withdraw a complaint that quickly, merely because someone spoke to them," she said. "They don't correct an archived record in 40 minutes merely because someone spoke to them." Rocco studied her for a moment, then said that no one had been hurt. He promised her that, and he didn't make the same promise twice. Marlo stood her ground, meeting his sharp gaze without a blink. "The question isn't whether anyone was hurt," she countered pointedly. "The question is why they were that afraid." He didn't answer. She didn't wait for him to. She wished him a good night and walked out, and the door closed between them, while that question remained untouched inside the room. The man knocked on Marlowe's apartment door at nearly 7 o'clock that evening, and he knocked exactly 3 times, no more. He wore a gray suit and carried a slim briefcase, and when Marlowe opened the door, he didn't enter immediately. He waited at the threshold until she stepped aside. He introduced himself, said he represented a client with interests in the area, and didn't name that client. He asked whether she would mind if he sat down. Marlowe pointed to the chair across the kitchen table. He sat, placed the briefcase on his lap, opened it, and removed a neatly clipped stack of papers. There was no envelope. There was nothing in the briefcase except paper. That was the first thing that made Marlowe understand the matter was more serious than she had believed. He pushed the documents toward her and told her to take her time reading them, that he wasn't in a hurry. The first page was an employment offer from a private hospital in Scottsdale, Arizona, inviting her to serve as the head nurse of its emergency department. The salary listed there was 3 times what she had been earning, and the line beneath it stated that the position included medical insurance for 1 dependent family member. The second page was a job description. The third was a letter from a transplant center in Phoenix confirming that Nell Quinn's records had been reviewed and that she had been approved for admission into its kidney transplant evaluation program, with her first examination already scheduled. Marlowe read the third page twice. She placed one hand flat against the table to keep it from doing anything else. The lawyer said nothing during that time. He merely sat still with both hands resting on the closed lid of his briefcase, and Marlowe realized that he had done this many times before, and knew that silence carried more weight than anything he could say. She turned to the final page. It was an employment contract containing standard terms, duration, benefits, and provisions governing the confidentiality of internal information. Then she reached Clause 14. It was printed in the same type as every other line, wasn't bold, and wasn't placed inside a separate box. It was merely one long sentence between 2 ordinary ones, stating that the signatory agreed not to participate as a complainant, witness, or provider of testimony in any legal, administrative, or investigative proceeding involving any medical facility where she had previously worked. Marlowe read the clause 3 times. Then she raised her eyes to the man across from her and said, very calmly, that he had done this skillfully. He tilted his head slightly, accepting the compliment in the same manner someone might accept a greeting. He said that nothing in those documents was illegal. The hospital in Scottsdale was a genuine facility with a genuine vacancy. The transplant center operated independently and had evaluated Nell's records according to its established procedures. He said his client simply knew the right people and called the right telephone numbers, and that things like this happened every day in this country for people with connections. "Miss Quinn," he said, "we aren't bribing you. We're offering you a job." Marlowe remained silent for a long time. She thought about the reclining chair in the last row of the dialysis center. She thought about the question her sister had asked the nurse, and the way Nell had spoken it so lightly, as though worrying about her older sister were a reflex more natural than breathing. She thought about 3 winters of working 2 shifts a day. She thought about the amount of debt she had memorized so completely that she no longer needed to look at the bills. Then she picked up the pen that had been placed on the table. She turned to the final page. She signed her name on the employee signature line, her handwriting neat and clear, exactly as she had signed every medical record throughout the past several seasons. Then she drew the pen back up the page, crossed out the entirety of Clause 14 with a diagonal line, and placed her initials in the margin beside it. She pushed the documents back toward him. "I accept the position," she said, "but I'm still going to court." The lawyer looked down at the page. He didn't appear surprised, didn't sigh, and didn't make another attempt to persuade her. He merely folded the documents, returned them to his briefcase, and closed the lock. "Then there is no position," he said. "I know," Marlowe replied. "I only wanted you to be the one who said it, not me." He stood, gave her the slightest nod, and left. The door closed. Marlowe remained alone at the kitchen table with the pen still in her hand, and she sat there until darkness had completely fallen. The review hearing took place in the second-floor conference room at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Marlowe arrived at 8:55 with a slim folder and 4 hours of sleep. 3 people sat on the other side of the table. Doyle represented the administration, his eyes lowered to the papers before him. The hospital's attorney was a woman named Renata Pyle, who wore the expression of someone paid to anticipate damage, and Dr. Yvonne Mercer was the chief medical officer, a woman who had worked in this building longer than the building had carried its present name. Whitfield wasn't a member of the board, but he was still present, seated in the row of chairs against the wall as the complainant, his suit immaculate, and a stack of documents arranged so neatly that anyone could see he had spent hours preparing them. He presented his case first, and he did it exceptionally well. Marlowe had expected that. More than 2 decades in the profession, most of them spent as a department head, had given him an ability to speak in rooms like this that no book could teach. He walked them through that night in sequence, one moment at a time, and every detail he gave was true. He had arrived within minutes of being summoned. He had assessed the injury. He had chosen a course of treatment consistent with the primary clinical presentation. Then his voice shifted into the register of a man describing what had genuinely troubled him, and he said that Nurse Quinn had become agitated, challenged his professional judgment in front of the entire team, forced him away from his position during an ongoing procedure, and independently performed an invasive intervention she wasn't authorized to carry out. He used the phrase unauthorized intervention 4 times. He used the word agitated 3 times. Every detail was accurate, and the entire structure was false. It resembled the truth in exactly the way a carefully constructed copy resembled the original, sharing enough details to sound convincing and differing only where those differences mattered. Mercer took notes. Pyle's expression didn't change. Doyle stared at the table. When Whitfield finished, Doyle turned toward Marlowe. She didn't challenge his account point by point. She had spent 2 nights thinking about this moment and had discarded every lengthy approach. She merely said that she wanted the board to open one item, the ultrasound image stored in the hospital's imaging system under the patient identification number from that night, recorded at 11:51. Doyle opened his computer, found it in less than a minute, and turned the screen toward them. Marlowe explained that the image showed fluid surrounding the heart, that it had been captured before any incision was made, that it had been recorded with the machine belonging to emergency room number 1 and automatically saved with a timestamp, and that at the same moment, she had sent an internal message through the medical records system, reporting the finding. Then she did what she knew was risky. She looked directly at Mercer and asked her a question. "You've interpreted images all your life," she said. "Is this ambiguous?" Pyle raised one eyebrow slightly. Addressing a board member directly fell outside the usual procedure and could be interpreted as an attitude problem. Marlowe did it because the only alternative was to allow ambiguity to be manufactured where none existed. Mercer looked at the screen. She studied it for a long time, truly examining it instead of merely appearing to, and she looked in the manner of someone who didn't care who won or lost in that room. Then she spoke. "No, it isn't ambiguous." The room shifted. There was no sound. The lights continued to hum, and Pyle's pen remained in her hand, but the weight in the room had fallen toward a different side. Pyle spoke carefully, moving in the only direction left to her. She said the issue wasn't the diagnosis, but the scope of practice. Even if the diagnosis had been correct, a nurse still wasn't credentialed to perform that procedure, and that was the matter the board was required to address. Marlowe allowed her to finish. Then she opened her folder, removed 3 sheets of paper, and placed them on the table. "I have a medical degree," she said. The words fell into the room and remained there. "I'm sorry," Pyle said. "What did you say?" Marlowe didn't blink, delivering her credentials with absolute authority. She explained that after 4 years of medical school and 4 years of surgical residency in Baltimore, she had practiced as an attending trauma surgeon before an orchestrated complaint sidelined her career 3 years ago. She had taken a nursing role at St. Auberon under her active secondary credentials, not to retreat, but to remain close to the clinical floor, while quietly investigating the discrepancies that had destroyed her practice. She said verification could be sent within an hour if the board requested it. Whitfield rose to his feet. He said she had never disclosed any of this, that no one in the building had known. Marlowe said no one had asked. She had been hired as a nurse, and she had performed the work of a nurse. Her former qualifications hadn't been relevant until someone in this room questioned whether she was competent to recognize a case of cardiac tamponade. For the first time since taking her seat, she looked directly at him. "I am qualified," she said. Mercer didn't call for a recess. She pulled the papers toward herself, read through them quickly, then wrote several lines, signed her name, and pushed the document toward Doyle. She said it granted temporary emergency practice privileges within this facility to Dr. Marlowe Quinn because the surgical department was currently without sufficient medical coverage. Then she looked at Marlowe. "I've just signed something that could cost me my job," she said. "Don't make me regret it." 2 days after the review hearing, a woman in a dark coat appeared at the first-floor reception desk and asked whether Dr. Landon Whitfield was in the building. Her name was Della Novak, and the identification she presented belonged to a federal unit specializing in healthcare fraud investigations. Everything happened very normally and very quickly. No one was placed in handcuffs in the middle of the corridor, and there was no commotion. Whitfield was asked to come down to a small conference room on the first floor to give a statement under a subpoena for records that had been delivered to the hospital's legal department the day before. He went downstairs with his private attorney, his suit still immaculate, still nodding and greeting to two nurses he passed along the way. Marlowe learned about it because Doyle called her. He didn't call to give her the news. He called because the investigators had asked the hospital to verify the identity of the person who saved the ultrasound images that night, and she was the only person who could sign the confirmation. She went down to the first floor shortly before noon. The small conference room was empty, its door open, and on the table sat a plastic tray holding the items people had been required to leave outside during the interview. A phone, a set of keys, a pen, and a worn leather wallet left slightly open. A female officer stood nearby, recording the inventory. Marlowe signed the confirmation, set down the pen, and as she turned to leave, her eyes passed over the open wallet. Inside the transparent front compartment, where most people kept family photographs, there was a picture. It was old, faded to a pale yellow, its edges worn smooth and rounded in the way that happened only when a photograph had remained inside a wallet for many years. Marlowe stopped. She leaned down slightly without touching it and looked. The photograph showed two men standing before a light-colored canvas tent. Behind them were a row of folding cots and a water tank bearing faded lettering. Both men wore short-sleeved shirts. Both were tanned in the way of people who had worked outdoors for weeks, and both were smiling. The man on the right was Landon Whitfield, much younger, his hair still dark, with one arm draped across the other man's shoulders. The man on the left was Ansel Prieto. Marlowe recognized him immediately. She recognized the way he stood, with his weight shifted slightly onto his left leg, a habit she had observed every day during the years she trained under him. She recognized the glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose. She recognized his right hand raised halfway, as though he had been in the middle of saying something when the photographer pressed the shutter, because he always spoke with his hands, and because he was always in the middle of a sentence whenever someone took a picture. She stood there for a long time. The female officer asked whether she needed anything else. Marlowe said no. She didn't ask where the photograph had been taken. She didn't ask what year it was from. She didn't tell anyone that she knew the man on the left. She didn't say that he was the person who had taught her how to position an ultrasound probe beneath the tip of the breastbone at precisely the angle she had used that night. She didn't say that he had died several years earlier in a place far away, and that she hadn't returned in time. She only looked at the photograph, while something shifted very slowly inside her mind, like a heavy door opening in a dark room, whose interior she couldn't yet see. Then she straightened, thanked the female officer, and walked into the corridor. She had gone about 10 steps when she stopped beside a window overlooking the parking lot, and she remained there until her breathing became steady again. She didn't return to the conference room. She didn't tell Camila or Doyle what she had seen, and when she went up to the 3rd floor that evening to change Rocco's bandages, she didn't tell him either. She asked only one question, very casually, while examining the drainage site. Had Prieto ever mentioned the people he had worked with at the medical camps? Rocco studied her for a moment. Then he said Prieto had never mentioned anyone. Marlowe nodded, secured the bandage again, and asked nothing more. Gideon Amato stood blocking the car door and didn't move aside when Rocco approached. The old man said the nurse had taken his temperature twice that afternoon, and it had been high both times, that the edge of the incision on his chest had looked redder that morning than it had the day before, and that anyone with eyes could see he had to brace one hand against the arm of the chair every time he stood. "Going out like this is suicide," Gideon said. Rocco stopped. He didn't argue with him. He merely said that if he postponed tonight's meeting, the entire city would know by morning, and the man waiting for him across town would read exactly one thing into it, that Rocco was weak. In their line of work, Rocco said, people weren't defeated because they were weak. They were defeated because they allowed others to see their weakness. Then he told Gideon to bring him his coat. The restaurant at the end of Passyunk Avenue had been closed since 6 o'clock that evening. The chairs in the outer dining area had been turned upside down on the tables, and only the innermost room remained illuminated, with a long table positioned in its center. Aurelio Vance sat at the opposite end, 4 men standing behind him, while 4 of Rocco's men stood along the wall at Rocco's back. Food had been properly arranged on the table, pasta and bread, and an unopened bottle of olive oil, but throughout the meeting, no one touched any of it. Vance was nearly 60, short and solidly built, and he smiled the moment Rocco sat down. He said he still remembered when someone had to lift Rocco up so he could reach the top of the table in his father's house. He spoke with genuine affection, and Rocco knew that was the most dangerous part of him, his ability to remember with true fondness while his hands were doing something else. For about 10 minutes, they discussed things that didn't matter: the port, the price of gasoline, and a mutual acquaintance whose wife had recently died. Then Vance placed both hands on the table and said what he had come to say. "Son, you're following the path of lawyers," he said. He said that if Rocco's father were still alive, this would have been finished the week before. It would have been handled cleanly, without paperwork, and without anyone having to sit and wait. He said Rocco had gone soft. Rocco allowed him to finish. His chest hurt with every breath, and he had learned to breathe shallowly so it would hurt less, but shallow breathing made him dizzy, so he chose the pain. "No," he said, "I haven't gone soft. I've only changed weapons." He said his father had settled everything in his own way, and he had died before he had the chance to grow old. Rocco didn't intend to die that young. "People aren't afraid of fists anymore, Uncle Aurelio," he said. "They're afraid of records. They're afraid of things bearing signatures and dates. And the man who controls the paperwork is the man who remains seated the longest." He intended to say one more sentence. He had already begun, but the words never reached the end. The first thing Rocco felt was the sweat. It came quickly, an entire layer of cold spreading across his forehead and the back of his neck in less time than it took to draw a breath. Then the ceiling lights blurred around the edges, and Vance's voice seemed to reach him through a wall. He could hear his own heartbeat inside his ears, fast and shallow, and he knew exactly what this was because he had read the discharge instructions, though he had told no one that he had. Infection. Fever. His blood pressure was falling. He gripped the edge of the table to keep himself upright, and he managed it for about 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds were what he thought about most afterward, because during those 3 seconds, he was still looking directly into Vance's face, and Vance still hadn't understood what was happening. Then Rocco's shoulder fell toward the left, the chair slid backward, and he went down to the floor. There was the sound of running feet. Someone shouted his name. Vance's men instinctively stepped back, their hands moving inside their coats, then stopped when they saw that none of the 4 men across from them were reaching for weapons. All 4 were rushing toward the empty chair. Gideon dropped to his knees beside Rocco and placed one hand against his forehead. The old man snatched it back as though he had touched something far too hot. Aurelio Vance rose slowly and looked down, and there was something on his face that was difficult to name. It wasn't triumph, and it wasn't pity. "Call an ambulance," Gideon said. "No," another man said more quickly. "Take him straight to St. Auberon. Call her." Marlo was at home when the phone rang, and she had already put on her coat before the person on the other end finished the second sentence. She reached the hospital several minutes before their car, and she was already waiting at the emergency entrance when they brought him in. One look was enough. His skin was hot and damp, his lips were dry, his pulse was rapid and thready, and the edge of the incision along his breastbone had swollen, surrounded by a ring of redness spreading outward on both sides, in the very pattern she had spent the entire week hoping she would never have to see. She spoke the diagnosis aloud for the entire team to hear: postoperative mediastinitis. Then said they had approximately 1 hour before this stopped being a surgical problem. Dr. Mercer answered the phone shortly before 11 o'clock that night and asked only one question: whether Marlo was certain. Marlo said she was. Mercer told her that operating room number 2 was available. Half an hour later, Marlo stood at the scrub sink outside the operating room, watching her hands beneath the running water and thinking that it had been nearly 3 years since she had last stood at a sink like this, as the person who would hold the scalpel. She waited to see whether her hands would tremble. They didn't. Inside the operating room, everything moved according to a rhythm she remembered more clearly than her own name. The anesthesiologist nodded to indicate that the patient was stable. The surgical assistant looked at her for 1 second, the look of someone who had never worked with her and was wondering what to expect. After the first 3 minutes, that look changed and didn't change back. She reopened the previous incision, cleaned the area, removed what needed to be removed, irrigated it again, and then irrigated it once more. She closed the wound more securely than necessary because she knew the man lying there wouldn't remain still as long as anyone else would. No one spoke except to say what needed to be said. She could hear her own breathing behind the mask, steady and slow, and the rhythm of the machine behind her. For nearly that entire hour, her mind was completely empty. There was no Whitfield, no board, no photograph inside the wallet, nothing at all except an open chest cavity and the things that had to be done to it in the proper order. When she said they were ready to close, the surgical assistant placed the suture in her hand before she could turn her palm upward. Gideon Amato was sitting in the row of chairs outside the operating room when she emerged, both hands still resting on the top of his cane, his back still straight. He had been sitting there since the car arrived. He didn't ask immediately. He waited until she pulled down her mask. Marlowe said Rocco was stable. She said the infection had been treated, that the antibiotics had been running since he arrived and would continue for many more days, and that this time he would have to remain still because there was no other choice. The old man nodded. Then he told her something she hadn't asked. His father died because of pride, Gideon said. He died young, and he died because of something that could have been settled simply by postponing it for 1 week. He looked down at his hands. I've held that boy since before he could walk, and all these years I've kept hoping he might become a little different. He paused. Tonight, I told him not to go. Marlowe said nothing. She sat in a chair a short distance from him, still wearing her surgical clothes, and the two of them remained there in silence for a while in the corridor, where the only sound was the distant echo of machines. Then she told him he should go home and sleep. Gideon said he would leave when the boy opened his eyes. Marlowe returned to the operating room to finish the last of her work, and she was placing the outermost sutures when the door opened slightly. No one opened an operating room door during surgery, unless something was important enough to disregard that rule. Della Novak stood in the doorway, properly dressed in a surgical gown and mask, and briefly said that she was sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Landon Whitfield had been taken into custody shortly before 10 o'clock that evening. Marlowe placed the next suture. Novak continued, saying that Whitfield had used his administrative privileges to access the hospital's imaging system and stored monitor data, and that he had attempted to delete 6 files. She said the server had been under surveillance since the previous day under a federal warrant, that the deletion commands had been intercepted before they could be executed, and that all 6 files remained intact. Marlowe placed the next suture. Novak said Whitfield would face federal charges for obstruction of an investigation, and that the state medical board had been notified. Marlowe tied the final knot, cut the thread, and raised her eyes to the woman standing in the doorway. I still have several sutures to place, she said. Please close the door for me. The list arrived in her inbox the following afternoon, accompanied by a brief note from Novak stating that she was being provided with this copy as someone who would testify before the state board, and that she wasn't permitted to share it with anyone. Marlowe printed it at the copy shop at the end of the block because she didn't want it stored on her computer. Then she brought it home, spread it across the kitchen table, and sat down with a pen. It was a list of cases in which the postoperative notes differed from the monitor data preserved in the system, arranged first by facility and then chronologically. She read slowly. She read the way people read medical records, not the way they read the news, which meant reading to find what was wrong, not to find what she wanted to see. The first column contained the facility code. The second contained the year. The third contained the patient's name, with the middle name reduced to an initial. She moved from top to bottom, lightly touching the tip of her pen to each line so she wouldn't skip one. And every time she reached a name, beginning with the letter Q, her heart lifted slightly, then settled again. There was a Quintero. There was a Quigley. There was no Quinn. She finished the first page, then the second, then the third. Afterward, she returned to the beginning and read the entire list a second time to make certain, and the result was the same. Her sister's name didn't appear anywhere on it. Marlowe set down the pen. She leaned back in the chair, closed her eyes, and released a long breath she had been holding since the moment she opened the envelope. She remained like that for about a minute. She thought about Nell sleeping in the next room, about the dialysis session scheduled for the following day, and about how, among all the terrible things that had happened over the past several years, at least one of them hadn't been caused by anyone's hand. It had simply been the misfortune of the human body. She rose to pour herself a glass of water, and while standing at the sink, she thought of something very small, something born more from professional habit than suspicion. This list had been compiled by patient name, but hospital systems didn't store records by name. They stored them by identification code, while the name was merely an accompanying data field. During St. Auberon's early years, before the old software was replaced during the system conversion. Patient names in outpatient and transfer cases were often entered manually by the billing department instead of being synchronized automatically. Marlo had corrected name fields like those dozens of times during her shifts. She returned to the table. She took out the file Gideon had given her, found the copies of billing records his men had retrieved from the insurance agency's public sources, and began again from the beginning. This time, she didn't read by name. She read by billing code, comparing dates, procedure codes, and facility codes. She worked for nearly 2 hours. Outside the window, darkness had completely fallen. Then she stopped. She stopped at a line that came before the first entry on the list, a line absent from the list itself. It belonged to St. Auberon, carried the procedure code for abdominal surgery, and bore a date from the spring she remembered more clearly than any other season of her life. The name field on the bill contained one incorrect letter in the middle initial. Only one letter. That was why the entry had been excluded when the list was filtered by patient name. Marlo sat motionless. She looked at that date, then at the date on the first line of the official list, and allowed the distance between those two dates to enter her mind. Her sister wasn't on the list. Her sister came before the list, before the case at the second facility, before the entire series of cases at the third, before everything. The first case. She placed both hands flat against the table, palms down, and held them there. She thought about how frightened a person must be the first time he did something like that. There must have been a night when he lay awake, waiting to see whether anyone would call and ask questions. Then no one called. No one asked. No one read the records again. The following morning, he went to work, and the sky didn't collapse, and he understood that it could be done. Everything that came afterward, every name on those 3 pages, every year that followed, every person whose face she would never know, had been made possible because the first time had gone unnoticed. And that first time had been her sister. Marlo remained at the kitchen table until nearly midnight before she finally stood. She had spent hours thinking about how to say it, and she had discarded every version because there was no way to make it hurt less. She knocked on her sister's door, then pushed it open. Nell was sitting against the wall with an open book on her lap, and the bedside lamp still burning. She looked up and asked why Marlo wasn't asleep. Marlo sat on the edge of the bed. She placed the 3 printed pages on the blanket between them, and then she spoke. She kept it brief, didn't explain the terminology, and didn't speak in circles. "The abdominal surgery you had that spring," she said, "it wasn't necessary. They ordered it for money, not because you needed it. The complication afterward was caused by the surgery, and your kidneys failed because of that complication. I've just found the records." Nell said nothing. She looked down at the 3 pages but didn't pick them up, and Marlo understood at once that something was wrong, because when people heard something like that for the first time, they reached for the paper. Nell closed her book. She reached beneath the mattress near the head of the bed and removed an envelope. All 4 corners were worn, and it had softened like paper that had been opened and folded again too many times. She placed it on the blanket beside Marlo's 3 pages. "I already knew," Nell said. Marlo looked at the envelope. She asked how long Nell had known. "More than 3 years," Nell said. She explained that a former nurse, who had been on duty during the surgery and had left the hospital not long afterward, had mailed her copies of the records without including the sender's name. Inside were the post-operative notes, a printout of the monitor data, and a handwritten note telling Nell to keep them. Marlo sat perfectly still. She asked why Nell hadn't told her. Nell didn't answer immediately. She turned the envelope once in her hands, then looked up. "Because I knew what you would do," she said. "I knew you would burn whatever you had left, trying to get justice for me. When you lost your medical career, and the man you planned to marry 3 years ago, I realized how far people would go to protect themselves. You were already working 2 shifts every day for my care, and I wasn't going to let you destroy the rest of your life for a fight you couldn't win. I hear you come home at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I hear you standing at the kitchen sink washing your hands before you come into my room. I wasn't going to let you lose whatever you had left." Marlo said that was her right. Nell said no. It belonged to both of them, and Nell had a right to half of it. She continued, her voice still quiet and calm, the kind of calm Marlo recognized as something practiced rather than natural. "You've taken care of me since I was little," Nell said. "You started before you were even old enough to take care of yourself. In all those years, I've never been allowed to do anything for you. Not once." She placed her hand over her sister's. "Let me take care of you just once." please." Marlo couldn't speak. She sat there with the 3 printed pages on the blanket and the worn envelope beside them, and something she had held intact since the night she placed her employee badge on the counter. Through the hearing, through the evening, when the lawyer sat at her kitchen table, through all the sleepless nights of the past several years, finally broke open. She cried. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders trembling, one hand covering her face. Nell moved closer and wrapped her arms around her sister. A thin, 21-year-old woman with a bandage still covering her elbow, holding the woman who had stood firm in a crowded emergency room and hadn't moved even when someone pointed a finger at her face. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Nell quietly said she was sorry for keeping it from her. Marlo shook her head. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "No, don't apologize. I'm the one who should be sorry. Because I let you carry this alone for more than a year without even knowing." "I wasn't alone," Nell said. "I had you. You just didn't know it." The sisters remained that way until Marlo asked whether Nell still had the handwritten note. Nell opened the envelope, removed it, and handed it to her. Marlo read it beneath the bedside lamp, a small piece of paper bearing several slanted lines written by someone in a hurry, with a name at the bottom. She read the name twice. Then she folded the note, placed it in her pocket, and told her sister that tomorrow she was going to meet someone. Rocco was sitting in the living room of his home that afternoon, still leaning against a pillow and still connected to an intravenous line in his left hand, when Gideon brought Salvatore Ricci inside. Ricci was in his 40s, with salt and pepper hair, and he stood in the middle of the room with his arms hanging at his sides, not knowing what to do with his hands. He had driven for Rocco's father since before Rocco was tall enough to see over a steering wheel, and he was the man who had taught Rocco to drive in the empty lot behind the old warehouse. Every Sunday afternoon throughout one summer, Rocco didn't look at him. He stared through the window on the other side of the room and remained that way throughout the conversation. "How much?" he asked. "Rocco," Ricci said. "How much?" Rocco repeated, still looking out the window. His voice wasn't louder this time, but it cut through the room. Ricci gave him a number, then he told him the rest, speaking very quickly, as though saying it fast enough might make it sound less terrible. He said his daughter needed spinal surgery, that the insurance company would cover only part of it, that he had borrowed money and no one would lend him any more. He said Vance's men had approached him in the parking lot, and they hadn't threatened him. They had merely asked whether he knew which road Rocco would take that night. He said he hadn't known what they were going to do. "You knew," Rocco said. Ricci fell silent. Rocco asked the next question, and it was the only moment in the entire conversation when something different entered his voice. "Did you ask me?" Ricci didn't answer. "Just once," Rocco said. "All those years you sat in the driver's seat in front of me, all you had to do was turn around and say one sentence. 'My daughter needs surgery.' That was all. Did you ask me?" Ricci began to cry. He cried in the way of a man who hadn't wept in a very long time and didn't know what to do with his own face. He said he had been ashamed. He said he had intended to ask, that he had stood outside the door of this house 3 times and turned away all 3 times. He said he kept thinking that if he asked, Rocco would look at him differently. Rocco still didn't turn his head. "I'll pay for your daughter's surgery," he said. Ricci looked up. "All of it," Rocco said, "including the rehabilitation afterward. The money will be sent directly to the hospital. It won't pass through your hands. It will arrive on time, and no one will ever mention this to the girl. Not now, and not ever." He paused. Then he told him the second part. "You will leave this state before tomorrow morning. You won't come back. You won't call anyone in this house. You won't appear at the funeral of any one of us. And if I ever hear your name in Pennsylvania again, I won't make a telephone call next time, Sal." Ricci stood there for a long time. He said thank you, and the moment the words left his mouth, he seemed to understand how terrible they sounded under the circumstances, so he said nothing more. He waited. He waited for Rocco to turn and look at him, and he waited far longer than was reasonable. But Rocco never turned. At last, Gideon placed one hand on Ricci's shoulder and led him to the door. When the door had closed, Gideon returned and stood in the middle of the room for a while. "Your father wouldn't have done that," he said. "I know," Rocco replied. "He wouldn't have paid for the girl's surgery." "I know." Then, after a silence, Rocco added that the girl had done nothing wrong, and if he allowed her to pay for what her father had done, he would be no different from the people he had spent his entire life trying not to become. Gideon studied him for a long time. Then the old man nodded once, only once, and walked out without another word. Rocco remained alone in that room until darkness fell, and he didn't turn on the lights. 3 days later, the federal prosecutor's office announced indictments against Aurelio Vance and 2 other men, based on the financial records of a construction company in Camden, and the flow of money that had passed through it for years. Della Novak asked her to come to a temporarily rented office on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Cranmore. The room was empty except for 2 chairs and a table, with nothing hanging on the walls. She didn't offer coffee. She placed 3 sheets of paper on the table, each one a record of a change in file status printed from a different system, and allowed Marlo to read them before she spoke. The first came from the dialysis center and showed that Nell's treatment schedule had been restored. The second came from the records department in Baltimore and showed that Marlo's file had been changed from restricted to approved for release. The third came from the State Board of Nursing and showed that the complaint had been withdrawn. 3 pages from 3 organizations with no connection to one another, located in 3 different places, and all 3 bearing the same afternoon. Novak said she had no recording. She stated it plainly in her first sentence, and Marlo understood that this woman was deliberately choosing not to lie to her, and that it was a strategy, not an act of kindness. "I don't know what was said during that telephone call," Novak said. "I don't have the contents. What I have is the timing. You left Mr. Santangelo's hospital room shortly before 11 o'clock in the morning. These 3 events occurred within the next 2 hours. 3 different organizations, none of them communicating with the others, all reversed their decisions on the same afternoon after all 3 had refused you during the previous week." She paused. "That is an inference," she said. "I know it is an inference. But Miss Quinn, an investigative file doesn't require evidence before it can be opened. This inference is enough." Marlo said nothing. She kept both hands in her lap and looked at the 3 sheets of paper, realizing that this was precisely what she had feared from the moment she stood in room 214 and asked Rocco what he had done to them. Novak continued. She said that under the law, receiving a material benefit from a criminal organization was something that had to be explained, even when the recipient hadn't asked for it and hadn't known about it beforehand. She said there were 2 paths forward, and both of them passed through this room. "You can be a witness," Novak said, "or you can be an accomplice." Then she placed on the table what she had saved until the end. She said that if Marlo agreed to provide a complete statement about every exchange between her and Rocco Santangelo, her sister would be admitted into the Federal Witness Protection Program, given a new identity, relocated to another state, and have all treatment expenses covered by the program until the case reached a final resolution. Novak added that her office would send a formal letter to the Maryland Medical Board, requesting that Marlo's old disciplinary case be reopened, based on the new findings concerning the person who had signed the independent assessment. She said she couldn't promise what the board would do, only that the letter would be sent. Then she told Marlo she had 2 days. Marlo asked exactly one question before leaving. "If I give a statement, what will happen to him?" Novak said she couldn't answer that. Marlo nodded and rose. She told Rocco everything that evening without concealing a single word, including the part about her sister. He listened to all of it. He didn't ask what she intended to do. He didn't say whether she should or shouldn't accept. He only asked how much time she had left, and when she said 2 days, he nodded and said, "Thank you for telling me." The following morning, Della Novak received a request for a meeting from Rocco Santangelo's attorney. The meeting took place in the same empty office, and Rocco arrived in a wheelchair with his nurse waiting in the corridor. He placed a box of documents on the table. He said it contained the financial records of a network that had transferred money from medical facilities through a construction company in Camden for many years, including ledgers, supporting documents, and reconciliations of the money flow. He said everything inside was paperwork. Novak asked what he wanted. Rocco said, "There are no names in this box. There are no statements. I'm not sitting here to identify anyone. And if that is what you're waiting for, you will be waiting a very long time. If you want to read it, then read it." Novak asked again what he wanted. "Remove her name from the witness file," he said. "Effective today. She is outside this matter." Novak said she had no authority to promise that, and even if she did, she shouldn't make such a promise. Rocco looked at her. "I'm not asking you to promise," he said. "I'm telling you my condition." Then he pushed the box toward her, turned the wheelchair around, and left. The name written at the bottom of the note inside Nell's envelope was Junie Alderman, and the woman was now a surgeon in Albuquerque. Marlowe called her, and they spoke for exactly 10 minutes. At the end of those 10 minutes, Junie said she would fly in. The state medical board hearing took place in a public room with several rows of chairs along the walls, 2 reporters, and approximately 30 people whose identities Marlowe didn't entirely know. Whitfield sat beside his attorney in the front row, his suit as immaculate as ever, but something about the way he held himself had changed. A faint contraction that only someone who had watched him enter a room and make the entire room slow down would have noticed. Junie Alderman testified midway through the hearing. She was in her late 30s, her voice steady, and she placed a stack of papers with yellowed edges on the table. She said that at the time, she had been a second-year resident. She had compared the post-operative notes from one case with the monitor data and discovered that the 2 records differed in 3 places. She had written those discrepancies down and taken them to the attending physician, Dr. Whitfield. She said he had read them very carefully. He had thanked her for being so thorough. Then he had explained why her interpretation was wrong, and he had done so very kindly and patiently, concluding that a second-year resident didn't yet have sufficient experience to interpret data like that. Junie paused briefly before saying the part that silenced the entire room. She said she had believed him. She said she left that program several months later and transferred to another institution, and that her transfer record contained a line stating that she had experienced difficulty adapting to the culture of the facility. Then she spoke about the years that followed. She said that every time she lost a patient, even patients anyone would have lost, even in cases where she had done everything correctly, there was still a voice inside her mind asking whether she might have interpreted something incorrectly, just as she had that time. She had lived with that voice for years. She said she had kept those papers not because she believed someone would need them one day, but because she hadn't known what else to do with them. Marlowe sat in the row of chairs against the wall and looked down at her hands. The proceedings lasted nearly the entire morning. Dr. Mercer presented St. Auberon's data comparison. A representative from the Federal Investigative Office presented the status of the case. Whitfield's attorney raised procedural objections, handling them skillfully within an extremely narrow space, and nothing he said was something the board hadn't already anticipated. At the end of the hearing, the board voted. Dr. Landon Whitfield's medical license was suspended, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the criminal case and the board's separate investigation into 2 cases involving harm to patients. Whitfield rose when the decision was announced. He said nothing. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, and he didn't pull away. Marlowe watched him leave, and waited for a feeling she had imagined in her mind throughout the past several years. It didn't come. What came instead was a heaviness that was difficult to name, the feeling of someone who had just witnessed the right thing happen after it had come far too late, and who knew that no hearing could restore the damage done during all the years in between. She walked out and found Junie Alderman in the corridor, and the 2 women stood together for a while, spending most of that time without speaking. 3 days later, in the first-floor corridor of the federal building, after the hearing where Whitfield was released on bail pending trial, Rocco Santangelo stood leaning against the wall near the exit. He had stopped using the wheelchair the day before, and now walked with a cane. 4 of his men were positioned throughout the corridor, but none approached. Whitfield emerged with his attorney, and as he passed, Rocco pushed himself away from the wall and stepped closer, near enough to speak without raising his voice, but without touching him. The attorney started to move between them, then stopped. Rocco spoke very softly. "Do you know why you're still unharmed?" Whitfield didn't answer. "It isn't because of the law," Rocco said. "In my line of work, there are many ways to deal with a man like you, and I considered every one of them during the week I spent lying in your hospital." He paused for a beat. "But a woman told me that if I did that, I would become exactly what you are, and I believed her." He looked directly into Whitfield's face. "You're alive today because of the very person you tried to destroy twice," Rocco said, "once with a signature in another state. Once with the report you wrote at 1 o'clock in the morning. Think about that. Every night." Then he turned with the help of his cane and walked toward the exit, and he didn't look back. He gave her the envelope on a weekend afternoon in the living room of his home, when he no longer needed the cane and walked only a little more slowly than an ordinary person. The envelope had yellowed with age and softened at all 4 corners, bearing the shape of something that had remained inside a man's wallet for many years. "He gave it to me after the surgery at that medical camp, when I still couldn't sit up," Rocco said. "He told me not to open it. He said that when I met his student, I was to give it to her." Rocco said that at the time, He had assumed it was a joke from a man exhausted after 20 hours without sleep. He said he had kept the envelope ever since, and he didn't explain why. Marlowe opened it. The handwriting slanted slightly to the right, the final letters of each word swallowed by haste. It was the same handwriting that had appeared on hundreds of notes she had read during the years she trained under him. He had written that if Rocco was reading those words, it meant the girl had saved him, and it meant he didn't teach her wrongly. He had written, "Marlowe, your hands are steadier than mine, and I'm not saying this to make you happy. I'm saying it because I watched those hands for years. Don't let anyone make you forget that." When Marlowe reached those words, she had to lower the letter onto her lap. She sat motionless for a while, and when she picked it up again, her eyes were wet, and she didn't bother wiping them. Then she turned it over. Several more lines had been added to the back in different ink, the handwriting more unsteady, clearly written at another time. He had written that if she was reading that far, it meant she had found him. "I tried," he wrote. "I tried to bring him down long before you arrived, and I failed. I failed because I wasn't strong enough, and because no one was willing to listen then. I couldn't find another way, so I taught you everything I knew, and I did it deliberately, one day at a time, throughout all the years you were beside me. I'm sorry for placing this burden on you." Marlowe read that passage 3 times. She thought about the evenings when he had kept her after her shift and forced her to repeat a procedure she had already performed correctly. She thought about the way he had asked her again and again, "Why do you think that? Why don't you think differently?" Until she became angry. She thought about how, throughout all those years, she had believed it was merely the difficult nature of an old teacher. She folded the letter and held it between both hands for a long time. Rocco said nothing, and that was the only right thing he could have done in that moment. The foundation was named after Ansel Prieto. Rocco proposed it the following week, a fund that would cover treatment expenses for patients who had endured surgeries they should never have been made to undergo. He offered to pay Marlowe to serve as an advisor. She refused the money and said she would serve as the unpaid medical advisor under 3 conditions. The financial records had to be public. There had to be an independent audit every year, conducted by a firm she selected, not one selected by him. And every dollar entering the foundation had to be clean, with a verifiable source, without a single exception. Rocco remained silent for a moment, then said, "You're asking me to change the way I earn my money. I'm asking you to choose what you want to be remembered for," Marlowe replied. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "All right." Nell's hospital bills were finally resolved during the winter of that year, not with Rocco's money, but through the settlement the medical facility was required to pay after her case was included with the others. Marlowe signed the papers in the attorney's office with both hands trembling faintly in a way they had never trembled inside any operating room. Dr. Mercer returned her employee badge on a Tuesday morning. One corner had become worn from the day it lay on the counter, and along with it, Mercer offered her a clinical management position in the emergency department. Marlowe didn't accept immediately. She asked whether the position carried the authority to change procedures, whether she could establish a rule requiring that whenever an employee objected to a clinical decision, the objection had to be recorded in the system with the time, rather than with the name of whoever had won the argument. Mercer said yes. "Then I accept," Marlowe said. She accepted not because of the title, but because she had counted, and she knew how many people in that building had learned to remain silent. She wanted to change that proportion, and no one could change it from outside the building. On her first afternoon back at work, she crossed the lobby and saw a young woman standing uncertainly at the intake desk, holding a child about 2 years old whose head rested against his mother's shoulder, his cheeks slightly flushed from a mild fever. Marlowe approached and pointed toward the row of chairs across the lobby. She told the woman to go to the rapid examination desk over there and tell them that the child had been feverish since the day before, but was still drinking normally. They would call her in soon. The mother looked at Marlowe with far more gratitude than the small thing she had done seemed to deserve. "You came to the right place," Marlowe said. "He'll be all right." She remained there until the mother and child were called inside, then walked out through the entrance. Rocco was waiting beside the car, holding a stack of papers containing the Foundation's operating plan for the coming year. Neither of them embraced the other. He merely nodded once and asked whether she was free the following day because there were more than a dozen people on the list who still needed to be called. "I'm free after 3 o'clock, Marlowe said, and perhaps that was the most memorable truth in this entire story, that quiet strength isn't silent because it's weak. It's silent because it doesn't need an audience to know that it's right. The truth often arrives late, sometimes so late that people have already lost many things while waiting for it. But it still arrives, as long as someone is willing to preserve a piece of paper, a photograph, or a timestamp on a screen. And a person's worth has never rested in the title printed on the badge worn over the chest, but in what that person chooses to do during the 40 seconds when no one is watching. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that together we can hear more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Marlo and the choices she made? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear what lies deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.